The tweet appeared on the evening of Thursday, December 18th, at precisely the moment when the corridors of Brussels were filling with the particular kind of tension that always precedes a historic decision. These summits rarely announce their importance out loud, but veterans of European politics know the pattern well. When leaders disappear behind closed doors late at night, the architecture of the continent is often being quietly rewritten. The message came from Robert Fico, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, a politician known not for diplomatic polish, but for saying exactly what he thinks, regardless of how uncomfortable it makes the room. In a political culture built on carefully sanitized language, Fico has always been an anomaly. In his tweet, he revealed that the leaders of the European Union were about to enter a closed-door meeting to debate a financial decision of staggering scale, a €90 billion loan for Ukraine, designed to ensure the country's military and institutional survival. With biting sarcasm, he noted that everyone walking into that room was fully aware of his fierce opposition to the plan. But then came the line that made historians and political analysts pause. Fico wrote that he was praying to God that no one would throw him out of a window for holding a sovereign opinion that diverged from the majority. He did not choose a vague metaphor. He used a word loaded with centuries of European trauma, defenestration. To a casual observer, it might have sounded like dark humor, but in Central Europe, words like that are never innocent, especially not that word. Defenestration is not simply an act of violence, it is a historical rupture. In 1618, angry Protestant nobles stormed Prague Castle and hurled Catholic officials out of a window more than 20 meters above the ground. That fall did not merely break bodies, it shattered the fragile peace of Europe. That single act ignited the 30 Years' War, a conflict that raged until 1648 and killed an estimated 8 million people, devastating Central Europe so thoroughly that some regions took generations to recover. By deliberately invoking that memory on the eve of a meeting with 26 other heads of state, Fico was not joking, he was sending a signal. He was warning that the decision what to be made was not just about budgets or counting tricks. It was about the internal cohesion of the European Union itself, and about the frightening possibility why that Europe, once again, was standing at the edge of a familiar historical abyss, a moment where fear, pressure, and competing interests could fracture unity in ways that would only become clear years later. After posting the tweet, Fico turned off his phone and walked into a meeting that would stretch deep into the night and bleed into the morning of December 19th. Behind those doors sat the leaders of 27 nations, preparing to engineer one of the largest financial rescue packages in modern European history. The stakes could not have been higher. When the doors finally opened the next morning, the exhausted faces emerging from the Brussels summit told a story before a single word was spoken. Something had gone wrong, or more precisely, something had changed. Yes, the European Union had agreed to provide Ukraine with the €90 billion it so desperately needed. On paper, it looked like a decisive act of solidarity. Headlines would later describe it as one of the largest financial support packages in European history. But beneath that surface-level victory lay a stunning reversal. The money was not coming from Russia, not €1 of the nearly €300 billion in frozen Russian central bank assets had been touched. The bold, almost poetic plan whispered for months in Berlin, Paris, and Brussels, forcing Moscow to pay for the war it had started, had quietly collapsed overnight. Instead of weaponizing Russian wealth, Europe had chosen a far safer, far more painful path. It would shoulder the burden itself. This decision fundamentally altered the meaning of the deal. Rather than making the aggressor finance the consequences of its actions, the European Union agreed to entangle itself in a dense web of shared debt and long-term liability. In effect, the financial punishment was redirected away from Moscow and toward European taxpayers, both present and future. The shock was not just that the plan had changed, but how completely it had been abandoned. Only hours earlier, Senior officials had spoken confidently about leveraging Russia's frozen reserves as collateral. Now, that idea was gone, erased from the final agreement as if it had never existed. The obvious questions followed immediately, and they were deeply unsettling. Why did Europe blink? Why did leaders walk away from seizing Russian assets when the moral arguments seemed overwhelming, when the money was already frozen, already immobilized, already beyond Moscow's reach? If the Russian billions were off the table, then where exactly was this 90 billion euros coming from? And perhaps most disturbingly of all, why was Europe willing to construct a financial mechanism that could, over time, tighten like a noose around its own economic future? These were not academic questions. They went to the heart of how power actually works in the modern global economy, and how fear, not principle, often determines the final outcome. To understand what really happened inside that room in Brussels, we have to look past the press releases and ceremonial handshakes. We have to examine the raw forces at play: legal terror, financial fragility, geopolitical intimidation, and the quiet influence of actors who never appear on stage. This was not a story about generosity, it was a story about high-stakes financial chicken, where every participant knew that one wrong move could trigger consequences far beyond Ukraine, consequences capable of destabilizing the European project itself. And before we can understand why Europe chose the safer, more expensive option, we first need to understand the scale of the disaster it was trying to prevent, because Ukraine was not simply asking for money. Ukraine was staring at a fiscal cliff, and the clock was already counting down. To understand why European leaders felt trapped, we first need to grasp the scale of the collapse Ukraine was racing toward. Imagine trying to run a modern nation while it is being systematically dismantled. You are at war with a nuclear-armed superpower every month. Your military burns through billions of euros just to keep the front lines from collapsing. Ammunition, fuel, logistics, vehicle maintenance, drone production, soldier salaries. The costs never stop accumulating, but a state is more than an army. You still have hospitals that must function, doctors and nurses who expect to be paid, schools that cannot simply disappear, engineers who repair the power grid every time a missile tears through a transformer, water systems, emergency services, civil administration. All of it must continue operating, even as the country itself is being hollowed out. Now layer on the economic devastation. Factories have been destroyed or shut down, export routes are severed as ports become unusable or unsafe, millions of working-age, tax-paying citizens have fled abroad as refugees. The productive base of the economy is shrinking at the exact moment state expenditures are exploding. The result is a catastrophic imbalance, expenses rising vertically, revenues collapsing to near zero. This was the cliff edge Ukraine was approaching, according to assessments from the International Monetary Fund and internal European evaluations. The numbers were grim. For the years 2026 and 2027, Ukraine faced a projected financing gap of €137 to €210 billion. This was not money for ambitious counteroffensives or long-term reconstruction. This was money needed simply to keep the patient alive. Experts warn that without a massive and immediate injection of cash, Ukraine's state treasury would hit zero by the second quarter of 2026. Zero is not a metaphor here. It means the government literally runs out of money, and when a state at war runs out of money, it does not enter bankruptcy proceedings like a corporation. The consequences are far more severe. The army begins to disintegrate, units go unpaid, supply chains break down, discipline erodes. President Volodymyr Zelensky was blunt about what that would mean in practice. Without emergency funding, Ukraine would be forced to halt production of some of its most critical defensive systems, including drones, that had become essential to offset Russia's numerical superiority. If the money stopped, the defense would collapse, not because Russian tactics suddenly improved, but because Ukraine would no longer be able to afford resistance beyond the front lines, though. Failure would cascade inward. Civil servants would go unpaid. Police officers and doctors would stop showing up. The social contract would begin to unravel, and a state that cannot pay its police, its teachers, or its soldiers does not remain a state for long. This internal implosion posed a danger equal to, if not greater than, the external military threat. All of this was unfolding against the backdrop of mounting sovereign debt. Before the invasion, Ukraine's debt-to-GDP ratio sat below 50%, uncomfortable but manageable. By late 2025, it had surged past 85%, with projections pushing it well beyond 100% once emergency loans were fully accounted for. In practical terms, Ukraine was already insolvent. It was being kept alive by an intravenous drip of Western aid, and that drip was slowing, and then, looming over everything, came a political shock from across the Atlantic that fundamentally altered the equation for Europe. While Ukraine was racing toward a fiscal abyss, a parallel shift was taking place thousands of kilometers away, one that European leaders had feared but hoped to delay. The return of Donald Trump to the White House fundamentally changed the strategic environment. Overnight, during the early years of the war, Europe had been able to lean heavily on American financial and military backing. Washington provided not only money and weapons, but political cover. As long as the United States was fully committed, European hesitation could be disguised as prudence. That cover was now gone. Trump's administration began sending clear, unmistakable signals. American patience was wearing thin. The focus was shifting inward, toward domestic priorities, trade balances, and negotiated outcomes rather than open-ended foreign commitments. Behind the scenes, the message delivered to European capitals was blunt: this is your neighborhood, this is your war, and this is your bill. For Europe, the implications were brutal. Without sustained American funding, the numbers simply did not add up. If the United States reduced or froze its support, the entire financial burden of keeping Ukraine afloat would fall squarely on European shoulders. And Europe knew something else just as troubling. Trump was not ideologically committed to Ukraine. In the way previous administrations had been, he was transactional. If he saw a deal that ended the war quickly, even at the cost of Ukrainian territory, he would pursue it. European leaders feared being dragged into a settlement they did not control, one that left them with the refugee crisis, the security risks, and the long-term instability. While Washington walked away, the ticking clock toward 2026 suddenly became deafening. European finance ministers and central bankers understood that they had reached a point of no return. Doing nothing was no longer an option. If Ukraine collapsed financially, the geopolitical consequences would be catastrophic. A Ukrainian state failure would not end the war, it would accelerate it. Russian forces would push westward, not necessarily because of superior strategy, but because there would be no functioning state left to resist them. Poland and Romania would find Russian troops at their borders. NATO's eastern flank would be permanently destabilized. Europe would face an outcome it had spent decades trying to avoid: a direct, enduring security crisis on its doorstep. And so, under immense pressure, European leaders searched for a solution that could achieve three impossible goals at once. They needed to deliver massive funding immediately. They needed to avoid detonating their own financial markets, and they needed to avoid burying Ukraine under a debt burden it could never realistically repay. It was in this moment, caught between urgency and fear, that a plan emerged which, at first glance, seemed almost too elegant, a solution that promised money without sacrifice, justice without risk. Russia broke the system, so Russia should pay for it. The logic, at least on the surface, was unassailable. Russia had launched the invasion. Russia had shattered Ukraine's economy, so Russia should be the one footing the bill. Since February 2022, the G7 nations and the European Union had frozen the assets of the Russian central bank held within their jurisdictions. This was not a symbolic gesture, It was one of the most aggressive financial sanctions ever imposed on a major power. We are talking about an extraordinary sum, roughly 190 billion euros immobilized across the global financial system, money that belonged to the Russian state, money that was no longer accessible to Moscow, money sitting idle, locked away in Western vaults and digital ledgers. To policymakers in Berlin, Warsaw, and Brussels, this looked like the obvious answer. The plan, championed by Germany, Poland, and the European Commission, was carefully crafted to avoid the most dangerous legal pitfalls. Europe would not outright confiscate the assets, an act that would almost certainly violate international law and set off legal chaos. Instead, the Russian reserves would be used as collateral. It was a standard financial mechanism, one familiar to anyone who had ever taken out a loan. When you borrow from a bank, you put up something of value, your house, your car, as security. If you repay the loan, you get it back. If you default, the bank keeps it. Under this plan, the European Union would issue a massive loan to Ukraine, backed by Russia's frozen assets, if Russia eventually agreed to pay reparations as part of a peace settlement. The collateral would be released. If not, the assets would be forfeited to cover the debt. Elegant, clinical, devastating. This approach promised several advantages at once. Ukraine would get immediate funding without crushing interest payments. European taxpayers would be spared direct financial pain. And Moscow would receive a clear message. The longer the war continued, the more expensive it would become to many leaders. This was justice delivered through balance sheets instead of bombs. The plan gained powerful supporters. Germany's new Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, who had taken office in May 2025 on a platform of stronger security and strategic clarity, argued that financial force was the only language the Kremlin truly understood. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen had spent months quietly assembling the legal scaffolding required to make the mechanism defensible. Teams of lawyers worked through the implications, searching for ways to frame the move as lawful, temporary, and reversible to the hawks within the EU. This was a no-brainer. Why should Europe borrow money and strain its own future when nearly 300 billion euros belonging to the aggressor were already frozen inside its system? For a brief moment, it appeared that Europe had found the rarest of things in geopolitics, a solution that was morally satisfying, financially efficient, and strategically punishing. But, as the leaders gathered in Brussels, this seemingly flawless plan ran headlong into a wall of reality, a wall that had a name: Belgium. To understand why Belgium could derail the grand strategy of an entire continent, you have to understand the hidden geography of modern money. Of the roughly 290 billion euros in frozen Russian central bank assets worldwide, the majority, about 210 billion euros, was held within Europe. And of that European share, an astonishing 86%, roughly 180 billion euros, was concentrated in a single country, Belgium. More specifically, the assets were sitting inside Euroclear, a massive financial services company headquartered in Brussels. Euroclear is not a bank in the traditional sense. It is part of the plumbing of the global financial system, a clearinghouse that settles transactions and safeguards assets for central banks, sovereign wealth funds, and major financial institutions around the world. When European leaders looked at the map, they realized something deeply uncomfortable. Using Russian assets as collateral did not just expose the European Union as a whole, it put a target squarely on Belgium's back. The Belgian government's resistance was not driven by sympathy for Moscow. It was driven by cold and sentimental self-preservation, and their objections fell into three categories, each more frightening than the last. First, the legal nightmare. Belgian officials understood immediately that Russia would not accept this quietly. Moscow would unleash a global litigation campaign, filing lawsuits against Euroclear and the Belgian state in every jurisdiction that mattered. Russia's argument would be simple and relentless. using sovereign central bank assets as collateral for a third party's loan constituted theft. It violated sovereign immunity and customary international law, and even if Belgium ultimately prevailed, the process could drag on for decades. In fact, Russia had already begun filing preemptive lawsuits in its own courts against Euroclear. The legal fees alone would be astronomical. Worse still, the uncertainty would poison Euroclear's entire business model. Euroclear holds over €4 trillion in assets under custody. Its value depends entirely on trust, the belief that when a central bank or sovereign wealth fund parks its money in Brussels, it will not become collateral damage in a geopolitical conflict. If countries like China, Saudi Arabia, or India began to doubt that trust, they could quietly pull their assets. A run on Euroclear would not just bankrupt a Belgian company. It could destabilize the euro itself and trigger a financial crisis that would make 2008 look manageable by comparison. Even the credit rating agencies were alarmed. Fitch placed Euroclear on a negative watch merely because the seizure was being discussed. The risk was existential. Second, the threat of economic retaliation. The warnings coming from Moscow were not subtle. The Kremlin conveyed a clear message. If this plan moved forward, Belgium would feel the consequences for decades. While Western companies had largely exited Russia, enormous amounts of foreign capital remained trapped inside the country. Estimates suggested that European, American, and British firms still had roughly $127 billion in assets stranded there. Italy's Unicredit Bank alone had exposure worth billions. Russia threatened to respond in kind. If Europe touched Russian reserves, Moscow would nationalize every remaining Western asset, factories, bank branches, equipment, intellectual property. Without compensation, Belgium feared that by unlocking the vault, it would become the trigger for a wave of expropriation that enraged corporate Europe. Third, and most disturbingly, the physical threat. Intelligence briefings circulated among European leaders hinted at darker possibilities. There were serious concerns about the safety of Euroclear executives and Belgian officials. Russia has long demonstrated a willingness to operate in the gray zones of hybrid warfare, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, coordinated disinformation campaigns, intimidation, and targeted pressure on individuals. Belgium faced the prospect of becoming the focal point of a sustained campaign of retaliation, digital, economic, and potentially physical. Faced with these risks, the Belgian government drew a firm line. Prime Minister Bart de Wever used a metaphor that perfectly captured the country's dilemma. Belgium, he said, was willing to jump out of the plane with the rest of Europe, but only if it could be certain that the parachute would open for everyone. Belgium demanded ironclad guarantees. If Euroclear was sued, who would pay? If Russia retaliated economically, who would cover the losses? The answer, Belgium insisted, had to be collective responsibility. But when it came time to put those guarantees on paper, the enthusiasm in other capitals evaporated. Belgium was not asking for permission, it was asking for protection. If the European Union truly believed in using Russian assets as collateral, then Belgium wanted that belief formalized in writing. If lawsuits came, if markets panicked, if Russia retaliated, the cost could not fall on one country alone. The demand was simple: shared liability. But when Belgian officials pushed for an indemnity clause that would legally bind the rest of the EU to absorb potential losses, the mood in the room shifted instantly. Germany hesitated. France stalled. Italy grew nervous. Everyone wanted access to Russian money. No one wanted to be legally responsible for the fallout. Signing that clause meant accepting open-ended exposure to potentially hundreds of billions in damages. It meant explaining to voters why their national budgets might be on the hook for lawsuits filed in foreign courts decades into the future. And suddenly, the grand moral argument began to weaken. Belgium was not entirely alone in slowing the plan, though its motivations were unique. Hungary's Viktor Orban, playing his familiar role, as the EU's internal spoiler, opposed any additional funding for Ukraine on principle. His alignment with Moscow was no secret, and his veto threats were predictable. Slovakia's Robert Fico, as his tweet had foreshadowed, was ideologically opposed to extending the war further. For him, the financial question was inseparable from a broader argument about sovereignty and national interests. Italy, meanwhile, expressed quieter reservations. Its concern was not ideology, but exposure. Italian banks still had significant assets trapped in Russia, a tit-for-tat. Escalation could hit Rome's financial sector hard and fast. What had once looked like a clean, elegant solution was now unraveling, not in a single dramatic collapse, but through what diplomats later described as death by 1,000 cuts. Each capital had its own red lines. Each leader had domestic pressures to manage. Each government calculated risk differently. The unity that European leaders loved to project in press conferences did not survive contact with the legal fine print. As the night dragged on in Brussels, it became clear that the plan to use Russian assets was dying. There would be no unanimous backing, no shared liability, no collective leap, and the consequences of failure were impossible to ignore. If the summit ended without a deal, Ukraine would continue bleeding toward insolvency. The geopolitical fallout would be immediate. A financial collapse in Kyiv would almost certainly translate into military collapse at the front. Russian forces would not need a breakthrough, they would simply advance into the vacuum left by a state that could no longer function. Poland and Romania would wake up to a new reality. Russian troops closer to their borders, and at any point since the Cold War, faced with this abyss, Europe's leaders understood something grim. They could not leave Brussels empty-handed. If the Russian money was too dangerous to touch, then another solution had to be found, one that delivered cash immediately while avoiding the radioactive core of the frozen assets. As dawn approached, exhausted and cornered, the leaders began to sketch out a compromise. It was not elegant, it was not bold, but it was survivable. By the early hours of the morning, the mood in Brussels had shifted from confrontation to exhaustion. No one was celebrating. No one believed they had found a good solution. They had simply identified the least disastrous one. If using Russian assets directly was legally radioactive, then Europe would do something more indirect, something that preserved the appearance of restraint while still unlocking money or Ukraine. The key insight was simple but cynical. Europe would not touch the Russian principle. Instead, it would use the interest generated by those frozen assets, the Russian reserves sitting inside. Euroclear were not idle. They were invested in ultra-safe instruments, short-term government bonds, deposits, and money market products. Even under sanctions, those assets continued to generate returns. And those returns were not trivial. By 2024, the interest income alone was producing €3 to €5 billion per year. This revenue stream, European officials realized, existed in a legal gray zone. While the principal clearly belonged to Russia, the ownership of the interest was far murkier, especially given that sanctions had blocked Russia from accessing it. That ambiguity became the loophole under the compromise. Euroclear would transfer the annual interest income into a special purpose vehicle. That vehicle would then be used to back loans raised by the European Union on capital markets. In other words, Europe would borrow the money itself, but the repayment would be funded by Russian interest earnings. This achieved several critical goals at once. First, it avoided outright seizure. Russia could scream theft, but Europe could claim it had never touched the reserves themselves. Second, it dramatically reduced legal exposure. Lawsuits could still come, but the sums involved were smaller and the legal arguments less explosive. Third, it allowed Belgium to breathe again. The existential threat to Euroclear was eased, and Brussels no longer looked like the single point of failure. In June 2024, the EU formally announced the deal, a €50 billion loan package for Ukraine, to be repaid over time using the windfall profits from frozen Russian assets. The money would begin flowing almost immediately. On paper, it looked like a triumph of European ingenuity. In reality, it was a confession. Europe had not solved the problem of frozen Russian assets, it had postponed it. The principle, the vast €210 billion, remained untouched, looming over future summits like a loaded weapon on the table. And the compromise came with a silent assumption that almost no one was willing to say out loud: that the war would not last forever, that sanctions would eventually end, that, one day, Europe would have to decide what to do with the money for real. Until then, the interests would buy time. Time for Ukraine. Time for Europe. Time to avoid making the irreversible decision. But time, as history has a habit of reminding policymakers, is never free. On the surface, Europe's interest-only solution looked clever. In practice, it rested on a stack of assumptions so fragile that a single shift in the war could knock them over. The first assumption was financial stability. The entire structure depended on interest rates staying high enough to generate meaningful revenue. But interest rates are not policy tools, they are economic conditions. If inflation falls and central banks begin cutting rates, the income from Russian assets shrinks. That €3 to €5 billion per year could quickly become €1 to €2 billion, and suddenly, the loan math no longer works. The European Union would still be obligated to repay the bonds it issued. If the interest stream fell short, the gap would have to be filled by European taxpayers. What had been sold politically as Russia paying for Ukraine would quietly become Europe paying for Ukraine. The second assumption was legal endurance. Russia had not abandoned its legal strategy, it had merely adjusted it. Instead of launching one massive case over the seizure of principal, Moscow could pursue dozens of smaller suits targeting the interest mechanism itself. Each case would be cheaper to fight. Each one would create uncertainty. Even if Europe won most of them, the constant legal pressure could scare investors, raise borrowing costs, and make future issuances politically toxic. The third assumption, and the most dangerous, was Russian restraint. The compromise assumed that Moscow would tolerate the loss of interest income indefinitely without escalating, but Russia has a long history of responding asymmetrically. If it could not recover the money through courts, it could apply pressure elsewhere: energy markets, cyber operations, covert economic disruption, or targeted expropriations. The message would be implicit but unmistakable. You may think this is safe. It isn't. And then there was the final assumption, the one no leader dared to voice, that the war would end before the money ran out. If Ukraine stabilized, rebuilt, and negotiated some form of settlement, the frozen assets could remain frozen, an unresolved relic of a closed chapter. But if the war escalated, if Ukraine began to lose ground rapidly, if Western support wavered, then the interest-only solution would be exposed for what it truly was: insufficient. A few billion euros per year cannot sustain a modern industrial war. At that point, the same question would return to the table, only louder, and under far worse conditions. Do we touch the principle? And if the answer becomes yes, the illusion of safety collapses instantly. Belgium becomes the battlefield again. Euroclear becomes the target. European unity faces its most severe test yet. The compromise did not eliminate risk. It merely delayed the moment when Europe would be forced to choose between financial stability and geopolitical survival. History suggests that such choices are rarely postponed forever. For now, Europe tells itself a comforting story: that the compromise is working, that Ukraine is being funded, that legal risks are contained, that unity, however fragile, still exists. But beneath the surface, the clock is ticking. The frozen Russian assets have become more than money. They are leverage, a pressure point, a silent ultimatum hanging over every future summit. As long as the war drags on, the interest-only solution buys time, but time does not change the underlying math. A modern war consumes resources at an industrial scale: ammunition, air defenses, infrastructure repair, salaries, pensions, energy subsidies. These costs do not shrink, they compound, eventually. €3 to 5 billion per year becomes symbolic rather than strategic. When that moment arrives, Europe will face a decision it has been delaying since the first sanctions were imposed. Does it cross the line? Seizing the principle would unlock a financial weapon unlike anything used in modern history. It would transform frozen reserves into an active tool of war finance, but it would also shatter a taboo that underpins the global financial system. Central bank reserves are supposed to be untouchable, even in war. Break that rule once, and every non-Western state will draw the same conclusion: their money is only safe until it isn't. The consequences would ripple far beyond Russia. China would accelerate its retreat from Western custody systems. Gulf states would diversify away from the euro and the dollar. The neutral world would begin building parallel financial plumbing, slower, less efficient, but politically safer. The privilege that allows Europe and the United States to borrow cheaply, trust, would erode. This is the trade-off Europe is trying not to name. Help Ukraine decisively now, at the cost of weakening the financial order that sustains Western power, or reserve that order and accept a slower, riskier path that may not be enough. Belgium, for all its reluctance, understood this reality first. It was not protecting Russia's money. It was protecting the idea that money, sovereign money, could exist outside the reach of brute force. Whether that idea survives the war may ultimately matter more than how the war ends, because once the line is crossed, there is no freezing history back in place.